Hi, and welcome to the show where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Poe, founder and editor of Kevin MD. Rate and review the show at kevinmd.com/rate. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/follow. Today on the show, we have Ananya Raghavan. She's an undergraduate student. She wrote the Kevin MD article reflecting on my experience as a teenage healthcare worker during the COVID-19 pandemic. Ananya, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. Pleasure to be here.
We'll get into your article in a little bit, but first off, just share your story and journey to where you are today.
Sure. So currently, I just finished my freshman year at Columbia University, where I'm majoring in biomedical engineering on the pre-med track. About a year ago, I was a senior in high school. It was the midst of the COVID pandemic. I was virtual, taking all my classes online. And so I was wondering if there was any way that I could, help with the pandemic efforts. And if you're 18, there's not really much you can do in
Mhm.
terms of healthcare related activities. But I knew that a pharmacy was recruiting near where I lived. And so I applied to be a pharmacy technician. And
Mhm.
18 is the minimum age where you can be a certified pharm tech.
Yeah.
So that is how my whole journey started. And that was sort of the motivation for also my Kevin MD article.
All right. So we can jump right into that. And it's titled Reflecting on My Experience as a Teenage Healthcare Worker During the COVID-19 Pandemic. Now, talk about that article. But before you do, what was your motivation to jump in and becoming a farm tech during your senior year?
Sure. So to be honest, I was finding it a bit online classes. It just wasn't as engaging as I was used to it being. I loved my in-person classes in high school. And so I was looking for something more to do. I was finding that I had a bit more free time on my hand because schools were shortened to minimum days. So I was looking at what other opportunities existed for me. And this was something that I had seen. And my friend who also worked at the same pharmacy had told me that they were recruiting. And so I I decided to apply and see what could happen, and that's what happened.
Yeah. So tell me about that experience. So you had no farm tech experience in the past, just applied. And what was it like, especially in the midst of the pandemic?
Yeah, it was a lot. I felt like I was sort of struggling. I didn't really know what was happening initially because in addition to all the regular pharm tech duties, pharmacy technicians during the pandemic had to worry about administering COVID tests, administering COVID vaccines. They also had to work with a lot more exposure to the virus. And so that involved looking at everything through screens, having, hindered patient interaction. And so there were a lot of challenges that just came with battling the pandemic in general. So, in addition to adjusting to a normal job as a pharmacy technician, which I had no prior experience with, I was also adjusting to what being a pharmacy technician meant during the pandemic.
So tell me about some of these obstacles and challenges that you had to overcome, specifically as it relates to COVID, because I'm sure during that time it was a little bit chaotic and the guidelines were changing day by day. So tell me what that experience was like. Walk us through a typical day from the lens of the pandemic.
Sure. And so I would go into work. And of course, at the counter, there's first of all a huge screen, which makes it sort of difficult to talk to the patient on the other end who might be picking up their medication. The other thing that we had going was a drive-through. And so I would often be manning the drive-through, which got very crowded because a lot of people had to get rapid COVID tests done.
Hmm.
And so initially it was difficult because we didn't have the equipment to conduct these COVID tests. So we would be shipping them to like places in Massachusetts, for example, and then people could get their results within 3 to 4 days until we finally got an Abbott machine that would allow us to do a rapid test. So until we had that machine in place, there would be like a line of 20 cars outside the drive-through because all of these people had to get tested. And it was not as rapid as one would like. So before that process was expedited, it was really hectic in the pharmacy. The other thing was the COVID vaccine.
Hmm.
And so a lot of people, especially in the at-risk categories, I mean like senior citizens over the age of 65, many of them came to our pharmacies specifically to get the COVID vaccine. And then later on, what happened was people started booking these appointments and they would not show up.
Hmm.
And so our pharmacy didn't have anything in place that would prevent these vaccines from going to waste. So I discussed this in my article as well, but that was something that I was seeing. So in general, there were these sort of adjustment periods. Not everything was perfect. There were some like rough ends. We hadn't quite worked out like the optimal solution as to how to deal with all the pandemic efforts.
So you talk about some poignant anecdotes in your article. Why don't you share with my audience who didn't get a chance to read your article some of these anecdotes that you shared?
Sure. So the first one that I introduced the article with is what happened on my first day at work. And so essentially, what happened, I'm this 18-year-old girl. I walk in and I'm told to step to the side by my colleague, which makes sense because I truthfully do not really know what's happening and it's my first day on the job. And I see this couple walk in and they speak in somewhat broken English, but I understand that they want to get the vaccine. That's what I took out of it. And so my colleague asked them if they had health insurance, and they nodded their head no. And so she turned them away because she said that in order to get the vaccine, you needed health insurance. And I had known before coming to the pharmacy itself, and this is in a lot of news channels
Mhm.
everywhere, that you don't need health insurance to get the vaccine. The vaccine is federally subsidized, it's paid for by our taxpayer dollars. And regardless of whether a person has or does not have health insurance, they're eligible for the vaccine. So, often on the questionnaire, when you are asked about your health insurance, it's mainly to gather data about groups of people. It has nothing to do with whether you're eligible or not eligible for the vaccine. But I knew all of this and I didn't say a thing. I just
Mhm.
sat there sort of silently watching this happen. And they left the pharmacy. And I remember thinking, well, that wasn't right. They
Mhm.
don't need health insurance. And so experiences like that, where I sort of knew something and I saw something that I had misgivings about, or I was confused, I sort of stood there silently. And many months later, I sort of reflected on this experience and I was wondering, well, what would have happened if I had said something? Could they potentially have gotten the vaccine if only I had opened my mouth? And so I was sort of interested in whether similar experiences happen in healthcare. And that was the motivation for me writing the op ed.
Yeah. So tell me about, I know you're just starting off on your medical education journey. What are some of the biggest lessons that you think that you've learned from this teenage experience as a farm tech?
So I guess some of the biggest lessons that I've taken away from my experience is that, we have a voice, and I think we have a voice for a reason. It's important to use it. So if I could do the whole experience again, I would definitely make more use of my voice,
Hmm.
raising it, making sure that my opinion is heard. Because something that I didn't realize until recently is no matter how, young you are or how inexperienced you are, you still have a voice and it's a valid voice. So it's especially tough, and I know people in healthcare probably face similar situations. There's almost like a as like a social totem pole, if you will, and your experience sort of dictates where you fall on that social totem pole. So for me, my inexperience, I felt that it invalidated my voice, and so I didn't raise these concerns that I should have. And that's sort of a lesson that I had taken away because in other settings where, for example, and this is mentioned in my article, where a nurse sees a doctor make a mistake, that can potentially have very damaging consequences. And so it's important in many scenarios, especially in healthcare, where we're dealing with people, their bodies, to raise one's voice. And so that's the biggest takeaway from my whole experience was the power of one's voice.
Now, I'm sure that you've replayed a scenario in your head many times. If you were to do this scenario all over again, how would you have raised your voice? Is this something that you would have done on your spot, keeping in mind this is your first day on a job? I know sometimes it's very difficult to speak up. What exactly would you have done differently?
There's a couple of different avenues, and of course, I do replay the scenario in my mind. So, realistically, because it was my first day on the job, a direct confrontation with my colleague would have been difficult, and me telling her, well, I don't think this is right. And I could have done that. And honestly, that would have been the best option because that could have prevented the couple from leaving the pharmacy right then and there. The other option was, of course, to alert the manager or somebody with more authority than myself or my colleague who could have kept them at the pharmacy and allowed them to get their vaccine. All it really takes is one person to raise the issue and another person to understand whether that person is correct or not and then make the final judgment. But unfortunately, I didn't take that step then. And I'm hopeful that in a future scenario, I would take that step.
No, absolutely. Well, just the fact that you're reflecting on it and you're so early in your medical education journey, I'm sure those are valuable lessons that you could take forward. We're talking to Ananya Raghavan. She is an undergraduate student in a pre-medical track. Her Kevin MD article is titled Reflecting on My Experience as a Teenage Healthcare Worker During the COVID-19 Pandemic. So during that time, during COVID-19, while you're working as a farm tech and your other interactions with the healthcare system, any other poignant experiences that you've learned from or come across as the pandemic progressed?
Sure. So there's a couple. One of the things which unfortunately I realized pretty early on is no matter how much I want to help, I'm somewhat limited. And it's a phenomenon that in the article I reference as learned helplessness. But
Hmm.
at some point, you realize that there is a limit to how much you can help. And often you feel like you're standing by and watching things happen and you're unable to do anything. So a lot of times, and this didn't even just happen once, but many times people came to the pharmacy and when to get their medication, I handed them the package and they see the copay and it's something that they can't afford. And so they leave the pharmacy empty handed.
Hmm.
And for me, that was an experience. I've never dealt with anything like that before, mainly because the medication is supposed to be the way of helping them. But if they can't afford the medication, then what am I really doing to make their lives better? So that was a tough experience for me to handle. And it sort of was difficult to reconcile that. Am I still helping if these people are leaving empty handed? Then what really is my role here? So that was one challenge that I faced. The second was also I had ideas that I wanted to implement. For example, I mentioned the vaccines going to waste. And this is not original. Many other pharmacies and workplace environments, they had this in place where, the excess would go to people on a wait list, for example. And so I had this idea, which is again not original, where people of high priority could be put on a wait list. So you would essentially tell us information about your age, your other medical related illnesses, for example, or conditions, and that would sort of help place you on this priority list. And so that would ensure that if somebody canceled last minute, that these people who are still looking for a vaccine may potentially be able to get one. But I was told that this is difficult. We would need to, create a form and that would have to go through an approval process to put on the website. And there's a lot of things that would have to be in place in order for this to happen. And so that idea was sort of shot down and we continued to waste vaccines. So at some point, it also goes along with this helplessness where you have ideas about how you can potentially help or improve a situation and they just don't happen, whether for feasibility
Hmm.
reasons, whether for any other reasons. And so those are the kind of challenges that I was facing and having to reconcile.
Now, you've had experience on the pharmacy side as a farm tech, and that's actually not a perspective that a lot of physicians like myself have. I often don't know what goes on behind the scenes in a pharmacy. So tell us, what's something that surprised you or something that's unexpected that physicians may not know about in terms of what goes on behind the scenes of the pharmacy counter?
Sure. I mean, physicians in general may know about this. I'm not sure all do, but I'll just talk about this because
Hmm.
I did see this happen sometimes. But when prescriptions are written, they're filled out by us where we copy the information written by the physician, either typed or handwritten. And so in that process, we get to see some information about what the medication may be related to. And I still remember how in the notes somewhere it was written that this patient was allergic to a medication. And it seems that the physician had actually prescribed a medication that was a derivative of what the patient was allergic to. And so that was caught by one of our pharmacy technicians, brought to the attention of the manager who called the physician and wanted to ensure that, the patient did not get a medication that they could potentially be allergic to. So there is this, it's almost like a role of a middleman,
Hmm.
sort of checking and rechecking decisions made by the physician or the doctor. And so in that sense, it's a pretty important role. And it was inspiring to see some of my colleagues, catch these mistakes and bring them to the attention. So again, it goes back to that idea of raising one's
Hmm.
voice, if you see something that may be potentially wrong.
And my final question, what are some of your take home messages that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience?
My take home messages, I'm pretty young, so I'm sure many people who will be listening to this will be much more experienced than me. But if I learned anything from my own experience, it would be the power of one's voice, like I said. So to not be silent, to see, if you see something that you believe is not right or you have misgivings about, to raise that concern because it may be valuable and it may, save something in the long run or the short term. So that's my main takeaway.
Wonderful. Well, best wishes on your continuing medical education journey. Thank you so much for sharing your story, time, and insight.
Thanks so much for having me.